So one last time for this module, it's time to practice what you learned. Here's another assignment. Of course, you find this assignment code attached to this lecture. We're going to practice working with dynamic styles now. Over the last lectures, you learned how to work with them. Now it's your turn to apply your knowledge on your own. In task number 1, I want you to fetch user input from this input field, for example with vModel, and store it in some data property, for example, to then use that entered value to add CSS classes to this paragraph conditionally. There are two classes available which you can enter, user1 and user2, because those classes are predefined here in styles CSS. Of course, you could also add your own ones if you wanted to, but these two already exist. And whenever the user enters user1 in this input, that user1 class should be added to the paragraph. Whenever the user enters user2, that class should be used instead. Maybe also experiment with different ways of solving this, because there will be more than one possible way of achieving this. The next task then still is related to this paragraph, but now also to this button. There are two classes, CSS classes in style CSS, hidden and visible. And you should switch between those classes with that button. When the button is pressed, you basically want to control some isVisible data point, which then in turn is responsible for adding the visible or the hidden CSS class to this paragraph. So you should switch between these classes and therefore hide or show the paragraph. In the third task, we're going away from dynamic classes and will instead work with dynamic inline styles. The user should be able to enter a color here in this input, and that should then be used as a background color on this paragraph, set with dynamic inline styling though. Not with classes, but with dynamic inline styling. As always, take my solution and compare yours against it, both my solution code as well as the video, in case you're stuck, but also try it on your own first. So, as always, were you successful with that? Let's solve this together. First of all, we need to create a Vue app, of course, where we pass in our config object, which we store in a constant or variable, and then we mount that to our assignment here, to this assignment section, selecting by that ID. And now the first task was to fetch the user input and use the input as a CSS class that's added to this paragraph. And the available classes are user1 and user2, because these are the classes I predefined in the styled CSS file. Of course, you could add more classes if you want to. To achieve that, I will first of all add my data option here to this configuration object. And in here, I want to store the user input. I'll name it input class, but the name is up to you. So here I want to store whatever the user enters into this input. And to easily get access to that, I'll use vModel. I don't really need two-way binding here, but it's just very easy to, well, get and store the user input with it, and therefore, well, I'll use it. As an alternative, you could of course use vUon or add input, and then manually extract what the user entered and store that in the input class data property. But vModel is simply a bit quicker here. So with that, I have the user input. And now to set this as a class here on this paragraph, I want to bind class dynamically. And we can start super simple. I don't need that object syntax here. Instead, I can simply bind it to input class. And now whatever the user enters will be added as a CSS class to this paragraph. It's as simple as that. So if I reload, I can type anything I want, and it will have no effect because no class of that name was defined in the CSS file. But if I enter user1, we see a different style. And if I enter user2, we also see a different style. But whatever I enter is added as a class. And you can confirm this by inspecting the paragraph, of course. You see now my strange input is added as a class. So every keystroke updates the class, but only user1 and user2 are actually classes that are also defined in the CSS file. Now, if you don't want to do this on every keystroke, if you don't want to add any input as a class, you can of course alternatively use the object syntax and add the user1 class if input class, so whatever the user entered and what's stored in this input property, if that's equal to user1, and do the same for a user2. This is a bit more code, but it makes sure that we only add user1 or user2 as classes and not any input. You can of course also put this into a computed property to get that long code out of the HTML code into JavaScript. But this is optional. I just want to show the different alternatives here so that you are aware of them. But with that, that's task 1 already solved. Now move on to task 2. There we have the toggle paragraph button, and we want to use the visible and hidden classes, which are defined here in the CSS file, to show or hide the above paragraph, so this paragraph. So we want to add hidden or visible. Clicking the button should toggle between those two options. So how could we implement that? Of course we'll need a click listener because we want to do something when the button is clicked. And then we could add a new data property, paragraph is visible, for example, which initially is true, let's say. And we want to change this property upon every click. So we can add a method here, which we could name toggle paragraph visibility, but the name is totally up to you. And in here, I'll set this paragraph is visible to what it's currently not, by using that same trick I showed you before. I invert the value so that if that was true, it's now false. If it was false, it's now true. Now I point at this method here on my click listener, and with that we are changing this value. Now we can use that value to add our hidden or visible classes to this paragraph. So I'm going to add even more classes, and that's now definitely the point of time where I will remove that from HTML and instead add a computed property to keep the HTML code short and readable. Now here in this computed property, I'll name it para classes. Name is up to you, of course. And I return this object here. Important, now input class needs to be accessed on this because we're now in the view instance. Let me reformat that to make it easier to read. And now I also want to add the visible class. If this paragraph is visible, is true, but this is a redundant check since true or false is the required value here for this visible value. For this visible property, we can just point at it. And we want to add the hidden class if not this paragraph is visible. So if this is false. And now we can assign para classes to this dynamically bound class. With that, if we reload, if I click toggle paragraph, it's gone. If I click it again, it's back again. So this now works. And now we got task number 2 solved. Task number 3 uses inline styling, which I mentioned you wouldn't use too often, but of course you should still be aware of how to use it. And essentially here, I want to make sure that the user is able to enter a background color, so either a hex code or one of the built-in colors like red and blue, and I want to set this as a background color to this paragraph. Now for that, again, we can add a new data property. Input background color could be a fitting name. And I want to set the style on the paragraph dynamically. Hence, I'll use vbind or the shorthand, just a colon, on the style attribute to pass in an object here and set background color, since it's a word with a dash, using this camel case notation where we omit the dash and instead capitalize the first character after the dash. and set this equal to input background color, so to this data property. And now we simply bind this with vModel again to save some time to that input here. So input background color. Now with every keystroke, whatever the user enters as a color is saved here in input background color. And we're then setting this as a color for the CSS background color property as a style on this paragraph. So if we now reload, if I set this to red, we got a red background. We can also go for orange or blue, or also use some hex code. That all works, and that's the styling assignment done. I hope you got a lot out of that, and with that, you're now prepared to make your next steps deeper into Vue land. Now that's it for this basics module. We basically had a look at 4 core topics throughout this module. And the first one was how Vue interacts with the DOM, how you connect Vue, and what you can do with that. We learned that Vue can be used to define the goal rather than the steps to get there. Vue follows a so-called declarative approach, which means you define your goal, your desired HTML structure in HTML code, and you connect Vue with the L property in the Vue instance options to then instruct Vue through the special syntax we learned about to output content, to update that content when it changes, to basically take control over that part of the DOM which you connected. And that makes working with it very simple because you don't have to define all those steps of getting there. You work on the bigger picture instead. Now, to work on that bigger picture, you need certain features. You need a special syntax you can use, and that is what we had a look at next. We explored data and event bindings. We can bind data with the double curly brace syntax for interpolation, which we can use between opening and closing tags of elements, or with vbind or the colon shorthand to bind attributes directly on elements. That is how we can output data in the end. That is how we can make sure that things in the real DOM change when the user clicks a button, does something, whatever it is. This is how we tell Vue to go ahead and manipulate the real DOM. Now, often we need events for that, and therefore we learned how we can listen for events with the vOn directive, or the add shorthand for it. And again, the idea here is simple. We can tell Vue that a certain method, for example, should be fired when a user clicks a button. And then we could be changing some data in reaction to that. And if we output that data in the template, Vue would recognize this and update the real DOM in the places where it needs to be updated. We also had a first look at Vue's reactivity. Well, that updating part I just talked about is an important part of that whole reactivity model. Vue.js recognizes changes and updates the real DOM as needed, without you giving any instructions to Vue. That is that declarative approach in the end. You don't have to tell Vue to do something, you define how something should look like eventually, and Vue will take care of the rest. Nonetheless, we also do have computed properties and watchers, which we saw in action in this course section, because with computed properties, we can derive data, we can derive values that depend on other values. It's simply more convenient to use computed properties than to put all that logic in the template. And with watchers, we can trigger certain code to execute when some other data changes. So these can also be really useful tools. And last but not least, of course, we had a look at styling. We saw that dynamic CSS class and inline styles are supported by Vue. We can bind class and inline, and we can especially use a special syntax there. For the other attributes which we can bind, we typically can't use that special syntax. But here we can use it to have an easier life when it comes to updating classes or inline styles. You saw the object-based and the array-based syntax in action throughout this module. Now, with that, we don't have everything Vue has to offer. There definitely is more, but we have the important foundation which we need to progress. In the next course module, we're going to have a look at how to output lists of data and how to render content conditionally before it's then finally time to dive into our first course project and see all those things come together in a real project. We got those important basics now. We learned how Vue generally works and how we can output content on the screen, how we can react to user input. Now, with the knowledge we got thus far, we'll be able to build a lot, but there are important missing pieces. And in this module, we're basically going to dive into those pieces. We'll learn how to render content conditionally, so how to render some parts on the page only if certain conditions are met, and how to output lists of content. For example, a list of course goals, a list of products, which should be rendered dynamically. And new items should be rendered when the list grows. Items should be removed if the list shrinks. This is what we'll dive into in this module. Specifically, we'll therefore dive into how to render content conditionally, so which tools Vue gives us to make sure that certain text is only shown if we got no products to be rendered, for example. We'll then learn how to output lists of data, so how to output a list of goals or a list of products, for example. And we'll have a first look behind the scenes of Vue and learn about one important optimization or one important feature when it comes to outputting lists of data. But let's get there step by step and let's get started with conditional content. So here's a little starting project with which I want to start. And what exactly is the problem here? What can we do with Vue to make this project better? Well, for one, my goal, no pun intended, is that we can add goals here, like finish the course, and when we then press add goal, currently nothing happens, that goal should be added as a goal in a growing list. If we have a look at the index.html file of the starting project, which by the way is attached to this lecture, of course, then you see in there, I got an unordered list with one dummy list item at the moment. And my goal is that the items we're entering here should be added to this list. And we also should be able to then click on those list items to remove them from the list. But that's just one thing which I want to implement with Vue in this module, and you will learn how that can be done with Vue. But for a start, I actually want to focus on something else. I have this message here. No goals have been added yet. Please start adding some. And at the same time, I'm rendering this unordered list with dummy goal. The dummy goal because currently we have no way of outputting actual goals. If we have a look at the JavaScript file in the starting code, you see I already created a very simple Vue app for you there, which is connected to the DOM and which has some data. Though the data it does have is just a goals array with an empty array initially. And now here's my problem which I want to solve with Vue. If this array is empty, as it initially is, then this unordered list should not be shown, it should not be part of the DOM, and instead this paragraph should be shown. On the other hand, if we do have goals, because we added some here in JavaScript, or because later we added code to grow this list here, if we do have goals, then I want to show this unordered list, I want to render this in the DOM, I want to include this in the page, and I don't want to show this paragraph. So we need conditional rendering. And if you think about modern web applications, that is something you need a lot. If you, for example, have a web application that fetches data from a server, you might want to show a loading spinner whilst you're waiting for the data to arrive. This is actually something we'll build together a little bit later in the course. So showing different content conditionally when certain conditions are met is a typical problem you have in front-end web development. And Vue makes it easy for us to solve it. Let's see how we can render content conditionally with Vue. So as outlined, I want to show this paragraph if we have no goals. So if this goals array here is empty. And I want to show this unordered list if we do have goals. So if we have at least one item in this goals array. That's my idea here. Now, how can we implement this? First of all, you already noticed, I'm no longer using this split screen. I no longer have JavaScript and HTML on top of each other because I think we got used to how Vue works with HTML, and I now want to have more space available for HTML and JavaScript. Hence, I'll just switch between those files. But that's just a side note. How can we now make sure that this paragraph only shows up if we do have no goals? So if goals is an empty array. Well, Vue has a directive for us. A directive we can add on the element that should be rendered conditionally. And that's the v-if directive. So it's basically like a if statement in JavaScript code. You check a certain condition, and then you have code that is executed if that condition is met. And we can do the same in HTML with v-if. We pass a certain condition between the double quotes here, and as always when using Vue directives, here between the double quotes, we can add in a JavaScript expression, and we can also refer to our data, our methods, our computed properties, and so on. And here, we can check if goals length is equal to 0. Goals is simply this data property I defined before. It's an array, and therefore it has a length property, and if length is 0, that means we have no goals. And then this condition is met, and this tells Vue that then this paragraph and all its content, including any possible child elements we might have, should be rendered. So if I now save that and reload, nothing changes because initially goals is empty. But if I go to app.js and I do add a goal here, like finish the course, a simple string, let's say, if I do that and reload, now you see the paragraph is gone. And it's not just gone visually on the screen. If we inspect this, we see in the developer tools, it's really not there. We have the unordered list, but we have no paragraph. Instead, we have this placeholder, which Vue uses internally to find out where to add the paragraph if our goals should be empty again. But that's what we get thanks to v-if. Now, in a static application, which isn't truly dynamic, because we have no way of changing goals right now, this is not too exciting, but it is a start. Now, let's make it a bit more exciting though. Let's say when this button is pressed, we want to get the value entered in this input and use that as a goal, which then is added to this goals array. To implement that, we can add a method in the methods option here. Add goal sounds like a fitting name. And in my data object here, besides storing the goals, I also want to store whatever the user currently entered in this input. So here I have my entered goal value, which is an empty string. Of course, you can name the property however you want. And here in the add goal method, I can now reach out to goals and use the push method, which is available on every JavaScript array, and therefore, of course, also on that array, to push this entered goal value, so whatever the user entered here, to my goals as a new goal. And now in index.html, we can bind both things. We can bind the input with vModel to this entered goal value data property like this. And on the button with add click, we can point at this method which we added. So at the add goal method, and point at it so that this method is executed when the button is clicked. And now we do have a way of changing our goals. That means that we now can also get rid of this hard-coded goal here, so that we start with an empty array again. And if we now save everything and reload, we see that we start with this paragraph, But now, if I add a goal like finish the course and click the button, you see the paragraph disappears. We don't see the goal yet because we haven't learned how to output that, but we see that the conditional rendering with VIF works. Now let's dig a bit deeper into VIF. There are a couple of things that are worth knowing about VIF. For one, you can have any expression in here that yields a truthy or falsy value, just as in a regular if statement. In here, you can also check whatever you want, and it will be interpreted as truthy or falsy by JavaScript. You can, of course, also combine conditions here with and or. That works. You can also point at a computed property. You can point at a data property. You can execute a method here, as long as that method returns a truthy or falsy value. That is all possible. But besides that, which should be fairly obvious, since it's really just like if in your HTML code, so it works like if in JavaScript, just in HTML. But besides that, there also is another directive you can use in conjunction with VIF. Because of course we don't just want to show this paragraph conditionally, we also want to show the list conditionally. And we only want to show this list if we do have goals. That means we can add VIF on that too, and we can check if goals length is greater than 0. Because only if it's greater than 0, only then we want to show this list. If we save and reload, we therefore only see the paragraph initially. But if I then add a goal, the paragraph disappears and instead we see the list with that dummy goal initially. This works and there's nothing wrong with it. But essentially, this is a little bit like the else case in a JavaScript if statement, right? And there you can also have else and even else if. That's all supported in JavaScript. And Vue also supports this in HTML with its directives. Instead of repeating VIF here, which you can do, but instead of doing that, you can also specify VElse. The only important thing is that VElse has to be used on an element that comes directly after an element with VIF on it. You can't have another element in between. If we have a paragraph in between, that would not work. VElse needs to be used on a direct neighbor element of the element which has VIF. This works, an element in between breaks it. But with that I can reload and get the same behavior as before. Now sometimes you also have scenarios where you have multiple possible conditions. And that's why you also have a VElse if condition, where you can check if goals length is, let's say, greater than 0. And then you could have another element with VElse in case that's not met and that's not met with your fallback content. In this case, that would kick in for a negative length, which of course can't occur, but I'm just showing this as an example. So VIF, VElse if, and VElse can be used to control which parts of your HTML code are really showing up on the final page. And I want to emphasize that it's not just about showing and hiding stuff. It's really about including those elements in the DOM or not including them. It's really about attaching and detaching. If you inspect this paragraph, you of course see that this paragraph is there, but there's no list below it. Now, if I add a goal like finish the course, watch what happens when I press the button. Watch here on the right side. You see, now the unread list was added and the paragraph completely disappeared. Now, because of VIF and VElse combined, by the way, Vue also doesn't need the placeholder anymore. But that's just a side note. So that's VIF, and that's very, very, very useful for showing content conditionally, which turns out is something you'll need in a lot of applications you're going to build. And this is how easy it is to implement it with Vue. Now, there is an alternative to VIF. There's nothing wrong with VIF, but there also is VShow. VShow doesn't work together with VElse or VElse if. It only works standalone, and therefore if you have multiple alternatives, you really need to use multiple vshows. That's one difference. But what does vshow do then? It seems to be more complicated. It doesn't have the simplifications with velse and velsif. So why would we use vshow? There's one important difference regarding its behavior. If I reload, we don't see a huge difference. It works in the same way. But let me reload again and let's inspect this. And then you'll notice a difference. The paragraph is there, but so is the unordered list. And the only difference is that the unordered list is hidden because its display style is set to none. And that's the difference. vif really removes and adds elements from and to the DOM. So it really impacts which elements are part of the DOM. vshow, on the other hand, just hides and shows items with CSS. Now, which approach is better? Showing and hiding with CSS means that you don't have to add and remove elements all the time, which can cost performance. Adding and removing elements can cost performance. On the other hand, it also means that you have a bunch of elements in your DOM which you don't really need at the moment, which also is not ideal. Therefore, as a rule of thumb, you should typically use vif and only fall back to vshow if you have an element which visibility status changes a lot. So if you have like a button that toggles an element and it's switching between visibility and being hidden all the time, that is when you might want to consider vshow. In other cases, use vif. And that's why I'm going to switch back to it, but I want to show you vshow as an alternative because, of course, it is important to know that as well for situations where you have content that switches a lot between being visible and being hidden. So we learned about vif, which is great for showing content conditionally. But we also have an array of content here. Potentially we have multiple goals. And it would be nice if we could output those actual goals, which we store in our Vue app, instead of this dummy goal. Well, of course, Vue has us covered for that as well. We now need to output a list of content. And that's also something you commonly have to do in apps. Consider lists of products, users, to-dos. Lists are everywhere in web apps. And therefore, of course, Vue gives us a tool for working with lists of data and outputting repeated content. Here, we want to repeat this list item with different content for all the goals we have. And Vue has another directive for that, the v-for directive. And you might see a pattern here. We have vif just as we have if statements in JavaScript. And we have v-for just as we have for loops in JavaScript for dealing with repeated code. And it's the same logic here. v-for is there to help us output content that's repeated. So for example, here, we want to output the same list item over and over again for every goal which we have. And we can do this by setting a value to v-for, and between those double quotes, as always with those Vue features, we can execute a JavaScript expression. And here, we can point at goals, which is our data property that holds the goals array. But not just like this. Instead, in a for loop in JavaScript, we have something like const goal of goals. This is how a for loop could look like in JavaScript. It looks quite similar in Vue. Here, we want to go through all goals, but of course we also want to get hold of each goal so that we can take that goal's text, for example, and output it between the list item tags. That's why the v-for syntax looks a bit different. We have goal in goals. Goal of goals also is supported, but you should use goal in goals, which is a bit different than the standard for loop in JavaScript, but you just have to memorize it like this. We loop through an array with the in keyword when using v-for, and now this name here, goal in this case, is totally up to you. You can name it G or GO or hello, whatever you want. I'm going to go for goal because this will hold every goal in goals for every iteration v-for does for us. And v4 will go through all the goals and give us access to every goal here. And why is that useful? Well, our goals are just strings in the end. We just add whatever the user entered, which is a string, to goals. So goals is an array full of strings. So every goal here is also just a string, and hence here between the opening and closing list item tag, we can use double curly braces to output goal like this. And this now has to be goal here if you used goal here. If you used hello here, for whatever reason, it has to be hello here as well. But I'm using goal, so let's revert that. Now what this does is it tells Vue that it should repeat this list item for all the goals in goals. So render as many list items as we have goals in the goals array, and give us access to every goal. And then inside, and that's really important, inside of the v4 controlled element, so between the opening and closing tags of that element, and also on the element itself, we have access to that goal. We don't have access to goal outside of the list item element here. So if I tried to output goal here in another paragraph, which is not inside of the list item here, that would not work. And I guess that makes a lot of sense. In regular JavaScript, if you have a for loop, even though it looks a bit different, if you have a for loop here, you also can't use this constant outside of the for loop. And it's the same with v4. So now this will repeat as many list items as we need for all our goals and output the goal text in our case between the list item tags. So if I now save that and reload this page, we can add finish the course, click add goal, and here's our goal. We can also add master view, click add goal, and here's the second goal. And you see that this list grows with every new item we add. And this is v4 and why it matters, because now we can really build a dynamic application where we render lists of content and also update that list when the content changes. And Vue does that updating for us. And it also does it in a smart way. If you inspect the list item here with the DevTools, I mentioned before that the parts which are updated in the DOM will flash. So if I add a new goal, watch what happens here on the right to those first two existing list items. You see, they did not flash. Only the third one, the new one, did. And that is how Vue updates the DOM. It does it in a very efficient way, leaving the unchanged list items alone and only adding a new list item, which of course is great for performance. It would be bad if Vue would re-render the entire list with every new item that we add. This would not be good for performance, and thankfully Vue doesn't do it. It's just important to be aware of such things because that helps you understand a bit more how Vue works under the hood. Now let's dig a bit deeper into v4. We're using v4 with an array like this, and that is honestly also probably the most common way of using it. But v4 has a couple of interesting variations. For one, you can, for example, pull out more than just the array item. You can also get the index of the item in the array. And doing so is simple. You just wrap your item, which you're pulling out of the array with every iteration, between parentheses, and then add a comma, and now you can add a second item here, give it any name you want, like index or IDX. I'm going for index here, and this will be the index of this item. So that's another syntax supported by Vue, getting not just the item itself, but also its index with this notation. And now here, we could, for example, add a dash, and that's not special Vue syntax, that's just a dash. And then again, add interpolation to also output the index if we want to. I'll quickly reformat that. And if I save that and reload, if I start adding goals, you see here, this has the index 0 because it was the first goal I added. Master view has index 1, and so on. So that can also be useful in cases where you need the index. Now, you can also loop through more than just arrays. You can also loop through objects. Now here, goals is an array, and you will probably most often loop through arrays. But in case you had a different scenario, you can also loop through objects. I'll quickly add a second unordered list here with a second list item with a second v4. And here, I want to loop through an object where I have my name and my age. You could, of course, create that in your data property in the Vue app. I'm doing it here in HTML, quick and dirty, but of course, if this would be a real app and a real example, you might want to move that into your JavaScript code. But now we have this object here, and I want to loop through it and its properties. v4 supports that as well, again with the in keyword, and here, I had to reload, by the way, that's why it's empty here on the right again. But here you can now get your different values stored in the different properties and output those between the list tags with interpolation again. And if you save that and reload, you see max and 31 because these are the values of those properties. Now, just how you can get the index for looping through arrays, you can also get the key name when looping through objects by wrapping this into parentheses, and then the second element you can pull out of this loop is the key. So that here you could also output the key with interpolation, then maybe a colon, which is just plain text, and then the value. And now you would see name colon max, age colon 31. And if you needed it, you could also get the index here, though of course that will probably rarely be the case, but that is also supported here. So you can also get the index just by adding it as a third element here if you're looping through objects. We don't really need it here for this demo app, but of course it is important for you to be aware of what v4 can do, and well, looping through objects is one of the things it can do. I'm nonetheless going to comment this out, because we don't need it here, but you should be aware of it. You should be aware of the fact that v4 can be used with object as well, and that you can retrieve the value, or the value and the key, or value, key, and index, if you needed that. One other thing you can do with v4 is you can loop through a range of numbers. You can also use it like this, and then output the numbers 1 to 10, for example. So whenever you need something like this, looping through a range of numbers by simply using v4 with in and then some number, that also works. Again, not something we need here, but something you should be aware of since, well, that is also something you can do with v4, and who knows, maybe you need exactly this behavior in your next application. With that, however, I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going back to our demo application with the course goals here. We're now able to add goals and to output them here in our list, and that's great. Now let's also make sure that we can remove items from the list to make this truly dynamic.